movement in history at the time. Going forward, the early years of the Cold War have been reevaluated by revisionist historians who tend to reject this, to some degree, this consensus view. Their view about containment is that the early years of the Cold War were fundamentally revolutionary. Um, Certainly, there was a level of consensus, there was a level of homogeneity in pop culture, but that the Cold War disrupted some very deeply held and long standing American beliefs. Here are some of the things that the revisionist historians tend to want to note about the Cold War. For the first time in American history, the United States is, is offering financial, military, and political support for foreign governments. For revisionist historians, this is a radical departure from what the United States had done in the past. Again, they're not necessarily saying bad, by the way, but they're saying a radical departure. This is a very far cry from George Washington's farewell address, in which he begged future American political figures not to intervene um, in European internal affairs, out of fear that it would drag us into conflicts that may not be in the national interest. Well, our very Cold War policy, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, that's exactly what they did. And again, George Washington is alive at a different time than Harry Truman, but certainly this, to revisionist historians, this was not continuity with the past. This was a significant break. Secondly, for the first time, we have a standing army. This was one of the things that was in the English Bill of Rights that was the basis for some Americans of their protest in the American Revolution, that we would have from 1950 forward a standing army, not just a standing army. To this day, we have far and away the largest military apparatus. In a future lecture, we'll take a look at how the current U.S. military, in terms of size and spending, compares to the rest of the world. But I believe it's something like our military spending on an annual basis is the next 7 to 10 countries combined. So this idea of not having a standing army, NSC 68 essentially killed that. We established permanent alliances, NATO. We're going to run across SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. We engage with international organizations. And in fact, we lead international organizations, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Along with that, we increasingly have military interventions that were not, that under traditional circumstances would not be seen as self-defense. There was no illusion that the North Korean military in 1950 was directly threatening the United States. Even South Korea, the US, we really didn't have any kind of alliance with them, right? But increasingly, as the Cold War would go on, we would continually engage again and again in countries around the world, our military would, when there was no clear direct threat to the United States. Again, certainly in the pursuit of containment, certainly in support of non-communist governments, but not self-defense by any previously held measure. Your emphasis earlier in the week was on the work of HUAC and Joseph McCarthy. In the interest of pursuing containment, there was an attempt to make sure that there was not communist infiltration within the United States government. And Joseph McCarthy took that to an entirely different level, to the point where, again, Americans became increasingly frightened of speaking their minds. They became increasingly frightened of associating with people for being seen as communist sympathizers. Certainly, this seems to be an infringement on some of the most foundational principles of the United States. Again, in pursuit of a goal, HUAC, probably legitimately, for some, like Joseph McCarthy, seemed much more interested in advancing his own kind of personal causes. And during this time period, and this will be explained more in next chapter, in chapter 27, the United States during the early years of the Cold War would begin aiding in the throw of democratically elected governments. We would see this in Central America. We would see this in the Middle East, in Iran. We will see it in Southeast Asia. So for a country like the United States that fought World War I and World War II in part to promote and protect the idea of democracy, the Cold War gave us challenges in which we wanted to oppose governments that would find support from the Soviet Union. But the challenge becomes, what does the United States do when a democratically elected government chooses policies that seem to be against United States interests? As a reminder, tomorrow you're going to have your Chapter 26 Focus Question Review Guide, quiz rather. In the morning, again, it will be posted which two of the questions that you have, and you're going to have until 4 o'clock to respond. There will also be a side question that is a result of this lecture, specifically asking about this idea of a consensus view of history and what its emphasis was and where it came from. I'm also going to post a link to a longer form article written in 1959 that goes more in depth about this idea of the rise of consensus politics, or rather the rise of consensus historiography.